As we said, constructors help get objects ready when they are made. They set up the class and prepare it to go. There are two types of constructors in C#: primary constructors and secondary constructors. Primary constructors are a new feature in C#12, making it easier to create constructors. In this lecture, we'll talk about primary constructor and we'll see how it can simplify things compared to the other type. Hello guys, welcome again. Okay, let's look back the player class from the last lecture. It has 3 constructors. The first one only sets the player's name, and like we said before, the compiler gives age and is captain default values of 0 and false when we don't set them. The second constructor works the same. It just sets the name and age, so is captain gets false by default again. This applies to the set overloaded constructor of the player class as well. This shows how constructors can initialize some values and leave others to their defaults, depending on what we include in each one. Okay, now let's make a primary player class with a primary constructor to show how it simplifies things. Okay. There are a few important things to know about primary constructors. First, a primary constructor doesn't need an access modifier like public or private. In the previous player class, all 3 constructors had public. But for a primary constructor, we don't include public or any other access modifier. Second, the primary constructor should be able to set values for all the properties of the class. For this primary player class, there are 3 properties: name, age, and is captain. So we should add 3 parameters, one for each property. That way, the constructor can initialize everything we need. Okay, let's define the primary constructor. We start with opening and closing parentheses after the class name. Then we list the parameters: name, age, and is captain. Okay, we're not done yet, but this shows the basic structure. No access modifier needed, and it should initialize all properties. Now let's go to the main method. Let's create an object of primary player and pass 3 arguments to initialize it. You may have noticed that, even though there are no secondary constructors in the primary player class, we don't encounter any errors. But what happens to the values we passed to the constructor? Before explaining, let's print the name, age, and is captain values of primary player 1. Run the application and see. As you can see, none of the past values were applied. Why is that? Let's go back to the primary player class. When using a primary constructor, we need to assign each parameter to its property. Now run it again. This time, the past values are set correctly to each property. Okay, this shows that primary constructors still need the parameter values assigned within the constructor body, even though they simplify the declaration. Alright, there is another important thing to know when using a primary constructor. If we add a secondary constructor to a class, it needs to directly or indirectly call the primary constructor. This ensures the primary constructor runs and initializes all the fields whenever a new object is created from any constructor. Okay, let's define a constructor in primary player that takes one parameter. When we do this, we get an error because we need to directly call the primary constructor of the class. To fix this error, we use the this keyword and pass the name and also provide default values for age and is captain. Now let's add another constructor that takes two parameters. We get a compiler error about needing a this constructor initializer. So we add this, pass name and age, and set is captain to a value. Next, in main method, let's create two more primary player objects. One passing name and age using second constructor, and one passing just name using the first constructor. Each constructor chains to the primary constructor which initializes the properties. Finally, let's print the values of these two new objects. Alright, go ahead and run the application. Now, as you can see, each object correctly sets its values into the properties through the primary constructor. This shows how secondary constructors must chain to the primary to ensure proper initialization. Now, let's compare these two player classes. Both classes have three constructors that create player objects. However, it's clear that when we use the primary constructor, our code becomes much cleaner and more readable. Okay, done. See you soon.